So since Prince Harry's security court battle has sort of blown up in his face. I mean, he lost the first time, and then he lost the appeal, and then he went on BBC to whine and moan about it. And as we discussed in our part 2 covering that interview, it really made Harry look weak, like he lacks an understanding and command of the situation, like he's completely incapable of solving his problems and figuring this out for himself. It gave the impression that he's really just gonna keep complaining until someone gives him his way, darn it, just like a toddler, unable to calm themselves during a tantrum. That's what it feels like. And we talked about how from even Meghan's perspective, this isn't very cool for her either. It's not very chill of Harry to be out there talking about this in this way, looking like he can't handle it, like he can't take care of his family on his own, like he can't solve these problems of his family's security all by himself, like most men can, most fathers do for their children. They figure it out and they handle it. And parents, not a guy girl thing, adults. He looks like he can't handle being adult. If you look at that BBC interview, he comes across weak and weak-minded. Most importantly, perhaps. And although it's not a stretch to think that Harry would just whine and moan until someone gives him his way, or indefinitely be a sore loser, that's no stretch of the imagination. We all know Harry seems vindictive and petulant and has a history of doing these types of things, of just complaining an awful lot and expecting everyone else to solve his problems for him. I mean, to an extent, that's a little bit understandable because he did have a lot of things handled for him up until he left the royal family. He had a job set out for him. He had people to help him. He surely had housekeepers and things like that always. So he had a lot of creature comforts, we could say, that were elevated, that made him not really grasp what real life really is like, but also perhaps stunted his ability to handle adult problems the way most of us have had to figure out since we were in our teenage years. So that's not necessarily a surprise that Harry's, acting this way like a big man baby and petulant, but at the same time, it's also a little bit difficult to understand what's really happening behind the scenes, which has led to a lot of speculation that this is fueled in large part by Meghan Markle. And also, I think for both Harry and Meghan, as I've said before, a downgrade avoidance. They really don't want to feel downgraded. And if there's anything that's going to make these two feel more special than the rest of the things, it's going to be having a big security entourage, making a big fuss, and making the plebs get out of the way so they don't have to share air with them. That's clear. Harry and Meghan have made that clear. But it still leaves this weird dynamic that's clearly happening. There is something fueling this weird vendetta against bringing the children back to the UK because they just took the kids to Mexico, allegedly to Jalisco, where there is a travel advisory that you shouldn't go there. And so clearly Harry and Meghan are willing to take their children out of the United States and to places that aren't necessarily categorized as total green light, safe place to go and frolic about for the weekend, which makes their avoidance of the UK and their unwillingness, their stubborn unwillingness to travel back to the UK with the kids all the more conspicuous and suspicious. And a lot of you have left comments. There's a huge amount of viewers and just public who think that this all comes down to Meghan. That Meghan Markle really doesn't want to come back to the UK for any reason, under any circumstances. And she was telling Harry behind the scenes that unless they get 24-hour police protection, they can't. But if he can manage to get that for them, then she and the children can come back to the UK, which totally makes sense. I think that there is a huge likelihood that that is the case, and that's true, that Meghan is using this sort of as a bargaining chip, if you will. I mean, it's hard to hear or think about that scenario playing out and have it not feel a little bit like blackmail. Like, unless you do this, I won't do that. But she's given him an impossible task. Requesting 24-hour police protection is not something that Harry can sort out or do because the answer's no, and sometimes no means no. So it's also very manipulative, if that is the case, because anybody who looked at it and listened to the legal experts or the legal advice that they were given would see that there's really no reason for Meghan to make this a requirement or a condition upon returning to the UK for whatever reason, but it's also no reason to believe that that would be possible. So for her telling Harry that that's a requirement is setting him up for failure and giving him an impossible task, which, if true, would explain, in part, why Harry seemed so emotional and irrational in the interview. He wasn't going to out the Meg and say, well, my wife said that she refuses to come back to the UK without police protection. He's not going to say that because Meghan probably told him not to, but also because it probably wouldn't sit well with Harry either, making him look like, well, my wife is making me do this, or saying that she won't cooperate unless I figure this out. You know, he probably wouldn't want to say that either. But if that's the case behind the scenes, then that would explain in part why he felt maybe came across more emotional during the interview. But regardless, his interview was kind of emotional in that he seemed genuinely upset about this. And of course, as we analyzed, it's very much just because he's not getting his way and he's not used to this and he's frustrated by it and he's trying desperately to find a way to manipulate someone else. Namely, obviously, he was trying to kind of signal to King Charles that he wants King Charles to solve the problem for him. But besides that, looking maybe a little bit deeper or peeling back the layers a little bit, thinking about Harry's experience here, it could in part be that Meghan was using this as some kind of leverage against coming back to the UK, and Harry's very much was trying to make this happen because there's no other real way forward with the Meg. I'm sure with all of her signals of high narcissistic traits that we have observed in Meghan, that she seems to be very keen to manipulate whenever it suits her and lies a lot, similar to Harry. But even still, within that relationship, for Harry's experience, he's dealing with somebody who's very unwilling to cooperate with him, who's very willing to withhold certain things or put him under strain in ways that are not necessarily fair. Probably. It would be logical to assume that that could be taking place. And so on a more personal level, he may not have been only grappling with the loss itself and the frustration of that and trying, one last desperate attempt to try to communicate that, well, if somebody could just wave a magic wand and fix this for me, everything would be fine. But he's also behind the scenes, perhaps between a rock and a hard place. Someone completely unwilling to cooperate with him and completely unreasonable. At the same time, I don't think it's fair to direct all of this blame towards Meghan in terms of the emotional charge of it. It's clear that Harry has a lot of misinterpretations of what's really going on. I think for the most part, Meghan and Harry view criticism as a wound, clearly. Meghan and Harry both threw tantrums and would request the press or the palace to, challenge any criticism that was published about them or said about them. They wanted exclusively positive press coverage. They wanted exclusively fawning receptions everywhere they went. They were really incapable of handling normal news stories that were maybe reporting on mistakes that happened, but they were also clearly very incapable and unwilling to hear any criticism and learn from it, which is part of their downfall, obviously. Because of that, we can infer that Meghan and Harry, hearing criticisms continuing to come their way, might think that those are, people who actually mean them harm in some way, because to them, a critique, a negative opinion, a negative comment, a criticism of something they've done or said is wounding. It is an affront, an assault to their sensibilities, to their personality, to their sense of self, all of that. It feels very much like an attack every time they get criticized or have a critical article published about them, which is constantly. But they have such thin skin that always feels like an attack, which is a mistake. It's not right, but it's clear with their ego and their narcissism that they do take these things as attacks on them. And so it could be that they interpret the level of criticism towards them as equaling some sort of actual real threat, because they interpret criticism as a threat in a way, like on an emotional and psychological level. So they could be interpreting the UK or other places. I mean, I don't see why the UK would be any more than the United States, because people in the United States really don't like Harry and Meghan and are very fed up with them, but whatever. You can't make anything they say make sense. There could be an argument made that they view the UK as a more threatening space because there is critical press about them coming out of the UK still, even though they don't live there anymore. And they thought if they left the UK, there would be no more critical press. No logic there. But regardless, perhaps they interpret it as a more threatening place. But really what that means is that they're trying to hide from the disapproval, from the boos. I mean, when Meghan and Harry got booed coming out of the service for the Queen's Platinum Jubilee, their faces showed it all. So it's clear that a lot of this has to do with avoiding that experience, really. They just don't want to be booed. They don't want people being able to shout at them or say things to them that they probably deserve to hear. They just don't want that. They want to avoid that at all costs. And so that's a big part of this as well. But as Janet says here, I can imagine Meghan Markle telling Harry, I'm not going back there unless we have full 24-hour security, but she doesn't want to come back anyway because she has hurt everyone there. Wouldn't you be ashamed in a room with the King, Camilla, William, and Catherine? I would be. That is such a good point. It's not just the public and the boos, it's also the family. She's not going to be able to avoid everybody who she has talked smack about and lied about. She's not going to be able to avoid every single person that she has burned a bridge with. Coming back to the UK, she's going to be around a lot of people and family members whom she has hurt. And she should be ashamed, but she's not. And I think that's part of the fascination with Harry and Meghan, is that they have no degree of shame and no degree of understanding of what they've done and how they've hurt other people and how that's not okay. Emma says, love is blind, and his choices, though they were wrong, were for her. I say this because he looks like someone who would even go to the world's end for the one he loves. He is starting to open his eyes, but the current reality is more hurtful, and he just doesn't know what to do. Yes, he had been warned more than once, but when you're under a spell, you just don't listen. I think a lot of people have felt this way with Harry, that he was being manipulated by Meghan, yes, and a lot of his actions were just from a place of trying to do right by her for a long time. But once Netflix and Spare came about, it's really hard to view those things, those projects. The Netflix show he did with Meghan, I'll link the playlist for you up here if you'd like to go back and take a look at that. But those projects, and Spare especially, were clearly Harry's choice at the end of the day. Yes, it seems Meghan helped with those a lot. Meghan was involved in the Netflix series a lot and probably had a lot of say in what they talked about and how they talked about it. But Spare, even though it's clear that she was involved in it to some extent, it was still his words. It was still the person, the ghostwriter was interviewing him, and it was he who did the voiceover for it. It was he who did the interviews for it. His name on the book. He could have gone a different route if he wanted, and he could have been more kind and less combative, and he could have at any point laid down his puny pebbles that he keeps flinging at his family to try to hurt them and just try to make right and own up. But I do agree that for a long time, Harry did seem like he was just kind of bewildered and being manipulated and trying to figure out how to sort this out. When Harry and Meghan did their engagement interview, I very much felt like Harry had a genuine sense of positivity for them and their future within the organization. I think Harry really did think that Meghan was a perfect fit, going to be a lot like Catherine in terms of how she conducted herself and did the work of the royals. And I think that Meghan sold him that. We've been over the amount of manipulations that she did, and the extent that she went to manipulate Harry was extreme. And because of this, you know, Harry seemed very much like he was under the impression that they were going to be really happy within the royal family and do the work, and it was all going to be peachy. And Meghan very much did not seem to have the same type of vibe or intentions, because even in the engagement interview, she didn't have body language and vibes that matched his when talking about joining forces with the royal family and doing the royal work and being part of the Fab Four, those sorts of things. Meghan and Harry were clearly on different pages, even back at the engagement interview. I can link that for you too. But for the first few years, it did feel like Harry was trying to make it work and just trying his best to figure out a way to make it work. But Meghan had gotten in there, and popular belief, the popular sort of consensus is that she then took those small seeds that Harry already had of anger and petulance, feeling like he had the short end of the stick, that he was hard done by, that things weren't fair, and that he was frustrated and sort of had a degree of anger towards his family that seemed muted for some time, or sort of almost like it was in hibernation. And Meghan pulled it out of hibernation and watered those seeds and really used those things and fueled those things to get Harry riled up. That's what it really seems like looking back on it all. That's what it felt like a lot of the times in real time while it was happening. I'd be curious to know your thoughts in the comments. But a lot of people think that that's kind of what happened. That yes, Harry was mad. Yes, Harry wanted out at certain times. And yes, Harry wasn't exactly perfectly happy and was always a little bit of a discontent sort of a person. But at the same time, he clearly had high hopes when he got with Meghan and seemed like he was genuinely excited and thinking things were going to work out perfectly. And then Meghan kind of took that and turned it on its head. And here we are. And Haida has a really good point on this topic as well, of the dynamic between Harry and Meghan, but also sometimes Meghan's dynamic of sort of copying the people she's around. But I think that this comment and this perspective was perfectly suited to Harry and some of these challenges with dealing with Meghan. She said, people pleasers also take on and start to act like the people around them. It's also a trauma response and could also be on the spectrum thing. Just throwing out some different points of view, because I used to do this too as a way to hide my true self, so that if someone didn't like me, it didn't affect me as much because I wasn't showing my true self, if that makes sense. It does make sense. It makes perfect sense. And I think a lot of people can identify with doing that at certain times, being a little bit more guarded because you're in a new situation or a new dynamic, or perhaps you're, not confident at a given moment or around a certain person at a certain time. But it could very well be that in sort of her manipulations of Harry, he started to take on more of her thought processes and accept her view of the situation as his own, which I talked about way back at the beginning when Megxit was brand new and just happened. And even before that, I had wondered, because Harry's statements to the press and stuff oftentimes didn't make a whole lot of sense, and according to everybody, weren't how Harry usually behaved. And so it felt very out of place for Harry to be so rageful towards everybody all of a sudden out of nowhere. And it could have been tied to, the fact that he did go through a trauma in his childhood that he clearly didn't resolve properly, or didn't try to resolve well enough, or perhaps just uses it as a bit of a crutch and blames everything on that. All could be valid possibilities. But because of that, he may have been more susceptible to Meghan's manipulations. It did feel way back when Megxit began, I remember saying that in one of my earliest videos, that Harry seems to be just taking on Meghan's interpretation of things. And because she isolated him from a lot of his friends and family members, he no longer had as independent of a point of view. And kind of just whatever Meghan said, he believed and then acted upon. And it created this weird cycle where he was more and more irrational, and at the same time, all the more agitated about everything because he was probably a little confused. And Meghan was behind the scenes sort of manipulating and controlling the situation in a lot of ways. But I'm really curious to hear what you think about this and how this applies to the security battle and his BBC interview. Whether you think Meghan is part of the conversation here. She has she has tried to distance herself from this a lot, which could be true, but it could also be a tactic to try to put distance between her saying that this is the condition for returning to the UK in a more manipulative sort of a manner. So I'm really curious to see what you guys think about this. If you think that a lot of this security battle circles back around to some of these earlier ideas that we all had in noticing Harry's interpretation of the world around him and his irrational, over the top, agitated reactions to things. Very reactionary style of going about the world. It must be exhausting. Leave your thoughts in the comments. It'll be an interesting discussion there. Thank you for joining me today. I hope you have a happy day ahead, and I will see you next time. Bye.